team's first photograph in spring training, like the day it was announced that the Braves were moving to Milwaukee, they took a team photo, and it's actually in my book. Half the guys are still wearing baseball caps with the letter B on it because they hadn't made enough hats with the letter M on it. And, the move was so abrupt, but it was also because Perini was playing his cards very close to his vest, because the idea of moving a franchise was very progressive, very aggressive. And, there was a lot of, talks, behind closed doors and, in corners to, where Perini really had to reassure Major League Baseball and in this case, the National League, that, moving out of Boston and into Milwaukee was the right thing to do. And so when the vote finally happened and it was announced and the news was made public, it caught everybody by surprise.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hello, gang. How are you? Despite all the obstacles, we are back for yet another episode of our favorite podcast exploration of what used to be in professional sports. Yes, Good Seats still available. Thanks for joining us. If it's your first time here, welcome. I appreciate you finding us in the vast array of podcast choices to download and listen to. And if you're a return visitor, well, I hope we don't disappoint you, for another episode. But thanks for coming back nonetheless. Today, we're going back to baseball. And we always love talking about baseball because it is a sport that lends itself, I think, probably the most to rich and colorful stories. It's obviously the most chronicled sports in the American landscape. But and today, I don't think is any exception. If you're an Atlanta Braves fan and you've somehow figured out a way to enjoy the team in its new digs up in the northern suburbs of Atlanta, you owe it to yourself clearly to know and remember the fact that the Braves are probably one of the, if not the longest lasting franchises consecutively in Major League Baseball. They started way back when in the late 1800s as one of the original franchises in those early years and leagues, and wended its way through some relatively morbid years in Boston, but then really took the world by storm, especially in Milwaukee when they moved to Milwaukee in 1953 and lasted from 53 to 65. 1965, they did the Braves of Milwaukee. And that's our conversation today with our guest, Bill Povletich, who is the author of a wonderful book about the Braves. And it's not easy to find a whole bunch of stuff about the specific time period that the Braves were in Milwaukee. The book is called Milwaukee Braves, Heroes and Heartbreak. And Bill is also the writer, director, producer of two documentary films about the Milwaukee Braves, one of which is called A Braves New World that he did with and for Milwaukee Public Television back in 2009. And a couple of years prior to that, did a 50th anniversary celebrating the 1957 World Championship team of the Milwaukee Braves. That film came out in 2007, was on Fox Sports back in the day. So Bill Povletich is probably arguably the one of the most knowledgeable folks around the history and the import of the Milwaukee version of the Braves from the late 50s and early 60s. That's our conversation today. It's really intriguing. Some very interesting things that I did not know about the team. And it's very also interesting to understand the unique dynamic that existed for a relatively brief period of time between the city of Milwaukee, the state of Wisconsin, and this baseball team, especially when it arrived. It was clearly a love affair, not a long-lasting one, but it has repercussions, and it also has some very interesting dynamics to the game of baseball writ large that I think arguably are not fully well known. And hopefully you will understand some of those from our conversation with Bill Povletich in just a couple of seconds. Of course, before we get there, we do want to tip our baseball cap to our friends at Audible, who has been kind enough to allow us to continue to promote their product And we appreciate you giving them a try. If you haven't already, please do so. And of course, by trying, what that means is a free audiobook download for you to enjoy and a free use of the Audible service for 30 days. When you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats to initiate such. Again, audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's your place to get a free audiobook download and a free exploration, if you will, of for 30 days of the Audible service. You can cancel at any time. And, look, there's you have one shot for free to get one of 180,000 plus titles in every genre, or just about every genre you can think of, in audiobook form. If you can't find something from that vast array of choice, perhaps you're on the wrong planet. Give it a try. You'll love it. I do. Audiobooks are awesome, and Audible is probably the best at it. audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's for your free audiobook download and your free 30-day trial. Thanks for giving it a try. We appreciate it. I'm sure Audible does too. And we appreciate their sponsorship very much. All right. So we are done with our promotional spiel, and we are now moving on to our interesting, as always, conversation with Bill Povletich about the Milwaukee Braves from the 50s and early 1960s. Enjoy.
I grew up in Mequon, Wisconsin, right outside of Milwaukee, and I grew up during the age where the Milwaukee Brewers, went to the World Series. So you had heroes like Robin Yount and Paul Molitor and Cecil Cooper and Raleigh Fingers, and I was really excited about them, and would love bragging about them. And then everyone's like, "Wow, if you think these Milwaukee Brewers are awesome, you should have been here for the Milwaukee Braves." So I always grew up with this passion to learn more about the exploits of Hank Aaron and Warren Spahn and Eddie Matthews and Lou Burdette and Del Crandall. And, I ended up, loving baseball as a kid, loving sports as a kid, and, dove into radio, television, and film as a career. And I began doing documentary films for the History Channel back when the History Channel produced documentaries on history, not on flea markets and rummage sales. And came across a book called Henry Aaron's Summer Up North, which chronicled his year of minor league baseball up in Eau Claire, Wisconsin, when he played for the Bears. And it was a fascinating story, and it really kind of sent me on this baseball journey where, it really rekindled my love for baseball, really rekindled my love of history, and it really, brought me into the world of the Milwaukee Braves in a very organic fashion. And I decided to, pursue that passion, and I wanted to write a book about them. So I started doing research, and I started pitching the book, and it was amazing how many people were interested in the story, but at the same time said, there's no market for a dead baseball franchise, because Atlanta didn't acknowledge the Braves years in Milwaukee because they want you to focus on the Atlanta years, and Milwaukee doesn't want to focus on the Braves because they want you to focus on the Milwaukee Brewers. So, I ended up, after a lot of diligence and a lot of work and a lot of rejection letters, my book, Milwaukee Braves, Heroes and Heartbreak, found a home at the Wisconsin Historical Society Press, and I couldn't be happier.
Well, so that's really interesting. So we, a lot of our various journeys into leagues and teams and things, there are certain, there is a certain a nostalgia or gap in such, right, for those teams and leagues. And perhaps there's a wistful memories or financial problems, or frankly, as time goes on, people just sort of lose touch or forget them all. But to me, these are like these are nooks and crannies of history that potentially become or could become forgotten without sort of, delving back into them and trying to at least record them in some way, shape, or form. And I think it's not lost on, look, I'm a soccer guy by history. I grew up watching North American Soccer League teams come and go back in the 70s and early 80s. And I see Major League Soccer today sort of on one level embracing some of the history of some of those past teams that were long forgotten, and yet with the other arm kind of pushing them away because they want people, to your point earlier, you want to kind of focus on today's league and growing it today without sort of the pesky stories of the past that may not be convenient.
Well, not even so much if they're convenient or not, but they don't have a direct financial tie to the current organization or the current franchise or the current league. So that's where like the USFL is a prime example where there's a lot of nostalgia for that, but because the NFL does not financially benefit from the nostalgia of the USFL, they distance themselves from it. Or some of the old minor league hockey leagues and franchises, or like you said, the North American Soccer League, or the World Football League. They're all fascinating leagues. They've all had an impact on sports. And that's one reason why when I first thought about doing this book on the Milwaukee Braves, because there wasn't there wasn't a lot in the marketplace, as far as books and kind of capturing the team's history, other than Bob Beege wrote a phenomenal book called Milwaukee Braves, a baseball eulogy. There wasn't a lot out there capturing the history of the Milwaukee Braves at the time. And so I was like, well, this is perfect. I'm going to get to tell all these great stories about, everyone's favorite ball players, on the field, and how they won the 57 World Series, and how when they arrived in Milwaukee, they were beloved. They were treated like rock stars. And the further I went down the rabbit hole, so to speak, the more fascinating I found the Milwaukee Braves story, because one aspect that was never really chronicled at length was the impact and influence the Braves had on all of professional sports. Because when they relocated in the spring of 1953, it was the first major professional sports franchise it was the first professional baseball franchise to relocate in 50 years. And so the Braves moved from Boston to Milwaukee. They have a phenomenal first year in 53. They break all these attendance records, and it forced Major League Baseball to re-examine its business model, because up until that point, most of the major cities on the Eastern Seaboard shared two teams. Philadelphia had the Phillies and the Athletics. Before the Braves moved, Boston shared the Red Sox with the Braves. New York had three teams with the Dodgers, Giants, and Yankees. Even St. Louis had two teams with the Browns and the Cardinals. So all of your baseball teams were really, shoved into very specific corners and very specific metropolitan locations. And the Braves' success in a region, because at that point Milwaukee was considered more of a region than a metropolis, it forced baseball to start re-examining places like Dallas and Kansas City and Minneapolis. And it essentially, the Braves' successful move after the 53 season proved, you could make baseball work in these other baseball-starved areas. And it created an urban arms race where cities started competing with each other to acquire this major league status of obtaining a sports franchise. Because, when you compared the financials, especially like on a city and a community level, pre-baseball franchise and post-baseball franchise in Milwaukee, between say 52 and 53, you saw the financial impact. There were very tangible numbers associated with the Braves arriving in Milwaukee. And whereas other cities, baseball grew in popularity with the city. So there wasn't this, line in the sand where you could easily track the financial and also the intangible influences of community pride of a sports franchise coming to your city. So Milwaukee really changed the game on that level. And what was also fascinating about that was how progressive the community leaders of the city of Milwaukee, the county of Milwaukee, and all of southeast Wisconsin were, as far as they built a baseball stadium. They built Milwaukee County Stadium prior to the Braves agreeing to come to Milwaukee. And they built that city essentially as bait, as lure, to say, hey, we got this beautiful stadium. Who wants it? And, that was really progressive thinking. So that also, was one of the blueprints for, the urban arms race and the combat that would happen between communities to try and lure franchises away from other cities.
Well, maybe we should kind of go back to 52, 53 when the beginnings of that process were kind of underway, right? So the owner at the time is this, I don't even know where Lou Perini's background and his source of money were, but he owned the team after, I guess, buying it when it was still in Boston. Maybe you can give our audience a sense of sort of what was sort of swirling in his head with this franchise that was clearly on the decline, at least attendance-wise, and even on field, right, in Boston.
Lou Perini was a construction magnate. He was a big deal in the construction world where he got big government contracts. He was working all over the Eastern Seaboard. And he and some of his business partners, who were nicknamed the Three Little Steam Shovels, purchased the Braves when they were in Boston. It was a fledgling franchise. They were always the second team in Boston. And he eventually bought out his partners and took control of the team. And first and foremost, Lou Perini was a businessman. He loved baseball. He loved the glamour of owning a team, being able to take potential clients to games, put them in, at the time, the owner's box, and wining and dining them during a baseball game. And, and he loved baseball, but the Braves were always a business first. And even though they went to the 1948 World Series, eventually losing to the Indians, the team never did well attendance-wise. Financially, they were always struggling because they were the second team in Boston. And what happened was, Milwaukee started to court him, and ironically enough, Bill Veeck, who used to own the Milwaukee Brewers, which was the Braves minor league team at the time, was trying to lure the two of them to Milwaukee as a major league franchise. So the St. Louis Browns and the Boston Braves are both being lured to Milwaukee. And Bill Veeck essentially had a handshake agreement to move to Milwaukee, but Lou Perini blocked it prior to the 52 season because he owned the rights to the city of Milwaukee because he had the minor league Milwaukee Brewers franchise there, which was under the affiliation of the Braves. So, it kind of put Lou Perini into a pickle because here he refused another major league team to come in, but, and everyone was pretty fired up about it. But, behind the scenes and, behind closed doors, Lou Perini was quietly and very cloak and daggerishly making plans to move the Braves as early as, in like 52, because I got to interview Lou Perini's son, David Perini, who was off at college at the time. And one time he came home from college and had dinner with his mom and dad and this man named Fred Miller, who is, at the time was running Miller Brewery. And Fred Miller was literally at the dinner table talking to Lou in front of David's mother, about, Milwaukee would offer Lou Perini if the Braves came to Milwaukee, and they were speaking in code, and David and his mother had no idea what this conversation was about until after it was announced that the Braves were moving to Milwaukee. But Fred Miller was a very instrumental part of the group that lured Lou Perini to Milwaukee, because Fred Miller, more than anybody, was ahead of his time as far as realizing the power and influence of marketing and, associating your brand with products and And first and foremost, so how important it was to have a major league sports team associated with your community. And, Lou Perini, announced the Braves move to Milwaukee during spring training of '53, and literally overnight they moved from Boston to Milwaukee, and the rest is history.
Well, I want to get back to that in a second, the specific dynamic of those weeks during spring training. But before that, do I have this right that Perini was also being wooed by, or at least other cities were interested in the Braves, including Montreal, Denver, Toronto, Houston, and Dallas, and Milwaukee kind of somehow stood out, or maybe later in the game actually, got ahead of even those markets?
Well, Milwaukee had a stadium that was plug and play. It was ready to move in. It was a major league caliber stadium. The other cities weren't quite as up to speed. Also Fred Miller and his influence with, the Miller brand, was important. And also for Lou Perini to move to Milwaukee, there was a lot less paperwork because he already owned the rights to the city in the Major League Baseball ties, because he had his, top farm club station there. So Milwaukee was always his number one choice.
Yeah, that's interesting because, maybe in hindsight, right? But you look at all those other markets I just mentioned, Milwaukee is clearly the smallest of all of them.
But, if you go back to, say April 1st, 1953, before the move actually happened, all those other cities, it was all untested ground. It was all, it was a frontier. It was the Wild West as far as league expansion, because it hadn't happened in 50 years. So, those communities might have been bigger, but, Milwaukee being the underdog definitely, I guess you could say their plan was really focused. The entire community was behind the franchise. And, and that's where I go back to Fred Miller, because he was a very influential man. He was running a multi-million-dollar brewery at the time that was, exploding, because that's when Miller was the champagne of beers. And, from everything, all the documentation, all the interviews, even when you look at old photos, it's like when the Braves had their welcome parade in Milwaukee, before the first game in '53, Fred Miller is everywhere. It's like he's a member of the team. He's, he's in the car with Lou Perini. It's like he's the guy.
Interesting.
So,
it's almost it's almost like he's sort of the hidden actor here in all this move.
Yes, he is the X factor.
All right, so but the move to Milwaukee wasn't, especially in those weeks during spring training, wasn't necessarily smooth. I think first of all, the fact that that Perini accepted this offer apparently during spring training leading up to the 1953 season, that just seems outlandish on its face, because who moves a team a few weeks before the season starts?
And, you can kind of tell the chaos, because most people didn't find out until, it hit the papers. It's kind of like today, when people don't find out, people find out, the facts or news, because it hits the internet, not because they get a phone call. And, the team's first photograph in spring training, the day it was announced that the Braves were moving to Milwaukee, they took a team photo, and it's actually in my book. Half the guys are still wearing baseball caps with the letter B on it, because they hadn't made enough hats with the letter M on it. And, the move was so abrupt, but it was also because Perini was playing his cards very close to his vest, because the idea of moving a franchise was very progressive, very aggressive. And, there was a lot of, talks, behind closed doors and, in corners to, where Perini really had to reassure Major League Baseball and in this case, the National League, that, moving out of Boston and into Milwaukee was the right thing to do. And so when the vote finally happened and it was announced and the news was made public, it caught everybody by surprise.
Well, it's interesting because I dug a little deeper here. My understanding is that there was a potentially pivotal week in March of 53 where, if I have this right, correct me if I'm not, the league apparently voted and approved the move, but the commissioner, Frick, came in and stopped it on the 7th of March in 53, arguing, like I maybe argued earlier, that was kind of too soon to the beginning of the season. And then Perini, I guess, maybe in a choreographed way, kind of announced that the move was off. And in steps some of the state officials from Wisconsin, because apparently around that time, the U.S. Congress had been investigating baseball for its antitrust protection, and they rattled the cages. And then I guess Frick backed down a week later, and the move was allowed to happen. So it seems like there was some static, some real static, for a good week there that maybe this team would be moving, but they may be not moving, and then ultimately moving again.
Yeah, I mean, that's, the move at the time was so gigantic and so, against, what most traditionalists were thinking. It's not surprising that there was, a lot of forwards and backwards. I mean, you even see it now, like with the Oakland Raiders' potential move to Las Vegas, or, the Chargers move from San Diego to Los Angeles, where even after a team announces it's moving, there's still all of this, scuttlebutt about, is it really happening? Do they have all their ducks lined up? Some of it's true, some of it's rumor, some of it's, hard feelings. As I always like to say, in the end, the Braves moved. So, that's history is written by the winners. And so in this case, it's written by the Braves who, got to Milwaukee. And, we can definitely get into it later, but what's the irony is how the blueprint that Milwaukee used to ultimately lure the Braves out of Boston was used against them by Atlanta. But we'll save that for later.
Well, sure. Okay, but let's talk about 53 then, because what a move, right? Because instantly it was proven, to be wildly successful, right?
Yes. Yeah, they ended up breaking attendance records. They ended up, obviously going from basement dwellers to, being in the pennant race until the end. The players, were treated like rock stars. They couldn't walk into a restaurant without, they would be, their meals would be comped. They'd walk into a grocery store. They walk out with free groceries. They had, like freezers in the clubhouse that were stocked full of ice cream and milk and meats. All the local vendors, wanted to be associated with the Milwaukee Braves and this winning organization. And, and then obviously the intangibles that Milwaukee enjoyed from the Braves, because Milwaukee County owned the stadium. And even though they, I want to say, charged the Braves $1 rent that first year, something ludicrous like that, because they just wanted the team in Milwaukee. The city and the county still made tons of money because, they owned the parking. They had their hands on the concessions in the stadium. They, obviously they increased bus routes to get to Milwaukee County Stadium, which was the first stadium not in the heart of a metropolitan area. Milwaukee County Stadium, which is now where Miller Park is located, is out in the Maumee Valley, probably about 10 miles west of downtown Milwaukee. And there was tons of parking. It was the first stadium built with a parking lot in mind, because in the 50s, this is when, post World War II, everyone's moving into the suburbs and everyone's starting to drive cars. And, that was one of Walter O'Malley's big gripes with his reasons for leaving Brooklyn, was that the city wouldn't give him a parking lot. And Ebbets Field only held like 500 parking spots. And he's like, the future is cars and parking, and that creates more revenue. And so he saw what Lou Perini did with County Stadium in Milwaukee and was like, look at all that parking. That is lots of money. So, all of these new revenue streams were created for the city and county of Milwaukee and the state of Wisconsin that went beyond ticket sales and concessions at the ballpark that really, in addition to the team being successful on the field, were, outrageously successful financially.
Yeah. So what's also pretty interesting to me is that, the Braves in Boston, their last season, had a winning percentage of like .418. They were like 64 and 89. And in their first year in Milwaukee, they had a very significant and substantial winning record of, I think it was 92 and 62. I guess a move is maybe good for the soul, but this seems a little ridiculous. I mean, how do you go from relatively bland and moribund to, clearly not winning the pennant at that point, but that's a pretty dramatic turnaround on the field that first year.
Well, yeah, I mean, a lot of it probably is, like I've mentioned, the intangibles, the fact that these players were beloved, and, they probably went out and tried a little harder, and, they were very visible in the community and, and celebrated, and, it boosts a man's pride, when you're treated like that. You want to go out and do, hustle a little harder, but also, the Braves kind of had a youth movement when they arrived in Milwaukee, where, when you look at the roster turnover between 52 and 53, Eddie Matthews was a rookie in Boston in 52, and he really kind of hit his stride when he got to Milwaukee. And, Billy Bruton, was in center field, and, and Del Crandall had just kind of showed up, and you had your wily veterans like, Warren Spahn and, I'm trying Joe Adcock, but, for the most part, the Braves, very quickly turned over their roster, and most of the faces and names you associate with the Milwaukee Braves really hit their stride when they arrived in Milwaukee. And, Hank Aaron, ended up, playing in 54, and Wes Covington, and, Johnny Logan, all those guys, really came into their own in Milwaukee. And that speaks a lot to, Bob Quinn's, John Quinn's, right? John Quinn, the general manager. I get John McHale and then Quinn. Quinn, the general manager, did a great job stocking the farm system.
Yeah, and clearly that started to pay off in the latter part of the 50s, right? Because 56 they ended one game behind the Dodgers. 57 they won it all. 58 they were in the World Series and lost to the Yankees. So maybe you can kind of regale in some of that, because clearly not only was the city and the region in love with the team because they had a team, but they also had a championship team and one that was competing for championships relatively quickly.
Yeah. In 53 and 54 and even 55, they were competitive. They were in the pennant race. If you kind of look back in the history books, that's when the Brooklyn Dodgers and New York Yankees seem to be in the World Series every year. And so the Braves were close, and were close enough, to give a guy hope, or, a fan hope. And, but they always would fall short. During the 56 season, Charlie Grimm was their manager. They ended up relieving him of his duties because management thought he was too player friendly, and brought in Fred Haney. And Fred Haney ended up steering the franchise to its World Series victory in 57 in 7 games over the Yankees. And then falling short in 58 and losing Game 7 of the 58 World Series after the Braves had a 3-1 series lead. And then even in 59, they were tied for the best record in the National League, and then lost a 3-game playoff to the Dodgers to get the pennant there. So essentially within 4 seasons, they were 2 games away from making 4 World Series appearances. So that's, was, as dominant as you could get in the 50s if your name wasn't the Brooklyn Dodgers, which is really a testament to John Quinn, the general manager at the time.
Okay, friends, sorry for the interruption. Just wanted to quickly remind you that today's episode of Good Seats Still Available is brought to you by our friends at Audible, the premier provider of digital audiobooks with over 180,000 titles to choose from in just about every genre you could think of. Audible titles play on iPhone, Kindle, Android, and more than 500 devices and MP3 players for listening anytime, anywhere. And for a limited time, my audience can listen to a free download of any book that they choose, as well as get a 30-day free trial when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And you can choose from over 180,000 titles, as we said, including one that I'm listening to right now. It's called The 10-Gallon War by John Eisenberg. That's the story of the NFL's Cowboys, the AFL's Texans, and the feud for Dallas's pro football future. Another one on my list, which I have yet to download but is on my queue, that could be interesting to our audience here, is called The National Forgotten League by Dan Daly, entertaining stories and observations from pro football's first 50 years. Those are just 2 of the many thousands of titles to choose from, and not just in sports history, but you name the genre that you might want to listen to, and Audible's got it. By the way, two guests perhaps that we'll have on the show, hopefully sometime soon. But again, go to audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 30-day trial, as well as your free audiobook download to try it out for yourself. Again, that's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And now, back to our conversation. Well, and clearly some notable and Hall of Fame names, right? So we mentioned a few of them, but maybe now's a good time to kind of maybe speak about some of the contributions. I mean, Hank Aaron, right? Probably needs no introduction, right? But in 57, he was the league MVP. He led the league, not a surprise, National League in home runs, right? Which obviously would accumulate to be even a bigger story later in the 70s. I mean, you had a pitcher in Lou Burdette who basically, in 3 games during the World Series was, there's no mistake as to why he was the MVP of that series over the champion the Yankees. But maybe you want to talk about Aaron or Burdette, Warren Spahn, you mentioned, who was more of a veteran, and Eddie Matthews, clearly, right? Somebody who played in Boston and in Milwaukee and in actually for a year in Atlanta. Maybe some of the contributions of those guys could be something you could kind of speak to.
Yeah, I mean, what was really cool was, during that era, before free agency, a player was on the team as long as the team wanted him, so to speak. So, your power 3 pitcher wise of Warren Spahn, who was the most dominant lefty in baseball at the time. And you had Lou Burdette, who was the perfect complement to Warren Spahn as a right-hander. And then the third one, who is sometimes kind of forgotten in the history books, but Bob Buell, who, the 3 of them, that was a very formidable trio that, back in the days when it was essentially a 4-man rotation, you had to face the 3 of them. You weren't going to get out of Milwaukee without really getting beat up, because the 3 of them, for that stretch in the 50s, was the most dominant trio on the mound. And then, the lineup of, Joe Adcock at first base, and then you had Eddie Matthews at third and Hank Aaron. It's like that 1-2-3 punch in the middle of your lineup. I mean, how do you survive that on a daily basis? And then, you had, Del Crandall behind the plate, who was a gold glove catcher and also pretty formidable with the bat. You had Johnny Logan, who, in a lot of ways was the sassy soul of the franchise, kind of gave it its swagger. And then, Billy Bruton in center field, who, he was, he was the speedster. He was the perfect leadoff man. And then, when the Braves went on their World Series run, they always kind of had this hole at second base, and they traded for Red Schoendienst. He's most renowned for being the St. Louis Cardinals Hall of Fame infielder and manager. And he joined the Braves during that stretch run, and, he was phenomenal. I mean, he really brought some leadership and some experience to that team and really helped put them over the edge. And then, regardless of how talented a roster is, you always find that these teams kind of get a little magic along the way. And the 57 season was Bob Hurricane Hazel. And he kind of was brought up and, because of some injuries, and he just lit up the National League. In the summer of 57, he had, some outrageous batting average, and he was getting clutch hits, and, he, in some ways helped carry the team on his back to the World Series. And then he came back in 58, was barely hitting the Mendoza line around 200. And, within a couple of years, he was out of baseball. But he was definitely that magical catalyst that season that, was one of those, kind of lost and forgotten, contributors who, really, really made a difference. And, you also had, the other unique personalities like Gene Conley, who is the only player to win a World Series ring and an NBA championship because he would spend his summers with the Braves and his winters with the Boston Celtics. And then Ernie Johnson, who was the reliever for that 57 club, became, the famous sportscaster for the Atlanta Braves. And now his son does a great job with all the TBS games. And I'm just trying to think, there's so many unique personalities and, contributors to that, especially that 57 World Series team. I mean, we could babble for hours about, a lot of their unique, contributions and, the really fun chemistry that they had in that clubhouse.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? Because I think most people would sort of look at Eddie Matthews and Warren Spahn and Hank Aaron, right? All Hall of Famers and substantially so, as kind of like, the standouts and as people look back on that, right? But you're clearly referencing that there was clearly other secret sauce afoot there, if you will, with other teams and players with other players clearly that, were more the glue and or the sort of standout personalities that, make up a team, right? You can't just win a baseball game and have a great season by, one's individual efforts alone, right? You need a team effort consistently, over 162 or whatever the number of games that year were. And I think those are the things that are probably most forgotten or fall through the cracks. And that's, I think, what especially your book certainly celebrates a whole bunch of. Yeah,
I mean, before, a closer was fashionable, back then pitchers would, wanted to pitch 9 innings, a complete game. The Braves had Don McMahon, who was, ahead of his time because he was the guy that gave the ball to in the 9th inning to get a save before baseball recorded saves. And the Braves also had local boy Andy Pafko on their bench. And, he was kind of in the twilight of his career at the time. He was almost like a player coach, but he was one of those clubhouse guys that, kept spirits high and positive. And, whenever he was called upon, he contributed. And, just having all of those pieces, you can't speak enough to, how Fred Haney managed the lineup every day, and how John Quinn, stocked that roster, with lots of different superpowers, so to speak.
So the love affair clearly is very strong, and then throughout most of the 50s, right? And now I guess I have to look back at old episodes of Happy Days and Laverne and Shirley, I guess, for some references, right? Because it's clear that period of time too. But circa 1960, 61 or so, right? Things start to, I don't know, slow down, right? I know in 1961, for example, 54 through 59, from what I can tell, the team was averaging each year around 2 million plus fans, which is, amazing, especially during the 50s, right? Yeah. Boom times, no doubt, but still 2 million fans for a season of anything, regardless of the era, is pretty impressive. But in 61, they were down to a 1.1 million, and then apparently 62 through 64, they were averaging in the high, the 800,000 fan sort of range. What happened? Why did the luster start to diminish, would you say?
The Braves' high point in attendance was the 57 season. And they won the World Series, and, they climbed the mountain. And by 58, it was almost like some of the fan base, the novelty of the Milwaukee Braves and the phenomena that was the Milwaukee Braves by 58 started to wear off because they had done it. They had won. And now instead of, everyone hoping they would win, they just expected them to win. And so attendance dipped a little bit, and it dipped again in 59. And in 60, they were in it, but they weren't in it till the end. And into the 60s, they had a winning record all 13 years they were in Milwaukee. But, in those later years, they really weren't in the pennant race. And, they weren't so terrible they were lovable losers, and they were no longer dominating. So they were just mediocre. And mediocre is the kiss of death when it comes to fan interest. And so you had the team, battling that. But one of the big factors that reared its ugly head in the early 60s was the whole time the Braves were, succeeding in Milwaukee in the 50s, the city and community leaders started to have buyer's remorse, where, they essentially rolled out the red carpet for the Braves and gave the Braves the key to the city for free, essentially. And now all of a sudden the Braves show up and they're, super successful. Obviously the franchise immediately, starts flying in the black after decades of being in the red in Boston. And those city and community officials started getting greedy, and they wanted their cut. They wanted to start charging the Braves, a lot of rent to stay at County Stadium. They wanted to tax the Braves. They no longer wanted to give the Braves breaks. And in the early 60s, about halfway through either the 60 or 61 season, County Stadium no longer allowed you to bring in carry-ins. Up until that point, people could bring their own beer into a stadium, which, you think today that is the most ludicrous thought in the world when, they're charging anywhere from $6 to $10 for a cup of beer. But back, during the heydays of the Braves' success in the 50s, a lot of people would buy two tickets, one ticket to sit in and another ticket to put their beer cooler. And they would just sit there with a 12-pack of beer and watch a baseball game, drinking their Schlitz or their Pabst or their Blatz. And, county and city officials wanted to crack down on that and wanted to start getting a cut of that. So they said, you can't bring your beer in anymore. You have to buy our beer. And obviously at the time, Milwaukee was, the center of the universe for beer manufacturing. And as you can imagine, the local residents really took offense to that. And the Braves lost a lot of fans at that point. And it just, the way it was handled, the carry-in ban happened halfway through the season, so it really felt like a cash grab. And the way it was rolled out was really fumbled, and it left a really bad taste in everybody's mouth, especially since the product on the field no longer matched, the success it had in previous years. And that's where you see the real dip in attendance. And, in a lot of ways, the Braves never recovered from that beer ban. Even, like a year or two later, they reinstituted that you could bring your own carry-ins, but at that point, nobody cared. The well had been poisoned, so to speak.
That's really interesting, because I wonder too if that actually. So I wonder if that was a league thing where they that move kind of maybe became a league thing, right? It sounds like that's the kind of the beginnings of what are today known as pouring rights, right? Where there's an exclusive, soft drinks as well as beer, where there's an exclusivity to what can be poured, obviously, for financial gain, right? For the team in the stadium.
Yeah. And, at the time, Milwaukee was the first city and County Stadium was the first stadium to kind of institute those rules. So, the idea that happened in, the center of the brewing universe, where, a big chunk of your fan base worked for the breweries, it couldn't have happened in a worse place. And the fact that Milwaukee was the franchise that crashed that glass ceiling, it was bad timing, bad place, bad time.
Do you think our friend Fred Miller had something to do with it, maybe to the benefit of the Miller Brewing Company, or was that, am I just reading?
No, Fred Miller died in 1954 in a plane accident. Him and his son were going on a hunting expedition, and he had died in 1954. And that will transition to the next phase of the Braves history, because rumor had it that Lou Perini promised to sell the franchise to Fred Miller when Lou Perini no longer wanted to own the Braves. And so when Fred Miller died in 1954, that changed that timeline. And as the Braves were struggling, Lou Perini decided to sell the team in the early 1960s, and Bill Bartholomew and his group out of Chicago, became the front runners and ultimately the buyers of the Braves. But, if you ask anyone, and you can definitely go back and, look at interviews and the history books, for all intents purposes, the Braves were Fred Miller's team to buy when Lou Perini decided to sell it. And his death completely changed the fortunes of the franchise. If Fred Miller lived, the Braves would likely still be in Milwaukee.
That's really interesting. And it's also unfortunate, too, that given Miller's, early exuberance for the team and arguably driving force behind the scenes to get the team to Milwaukee, he was unable to really see the success in the later part of the decade. I didn't realize that he had passed in 1954.
Yeah. I mean, it was a shock. And, you get, you talk to the players, you talk to, the people that were in the clubhouse or the front office, or even when I talked to David Perini, Lou Perini's son, it's like all indications were that, it was Fred Miller's team once Lou decided he no longer wanted to own the team. And, so that left Lou Perini looking for prospective buyers when he wanted to sell the team in the early 1960s.
All right, well, let's segue into Bartholomew, who, by the way, is still with us. I think he's closing in on his 90th birthday soon. I don't, he'd be an interesting conversation. I don't know if he's, willing or able, frankly, to have a conversation about this. But based on your investigations, both for book and for film, maybe you can give us some sense of sort of how he came into the picture and sort of what was in his mind by taking over the team for Perini in 1, 2?
Yeah. Here's something that's, fascinating is after I wrote the book, and the Wisconsin Historical Society Press, set up these opportunities for me to speak to groups, either like Lions clubs or Rotary clubs or, libraries or book signings at, like at a Barnes and Noble. I would often get up in front of a group and, I was born after the Braves moved. So I came at this project with a very pragmatic perspective. I love the Braves. I appreciated what they did for the city, but I also didn't bleed and sweat and cry and cheer with them every game along the way. The Braves were already history in Milwaukee by the time I was born. And I would get in front of these groups and I could see them looking back at me. And these are, men and women who were at County Stadium for Warren Spahn's no-hitter or, Hank Aaron's pennant clinching home run. And they would just look at me and be like, "Oh, are you here to introduce your dad?" Because you're too young to care about the Braves. And, my response would always be, if I was up here talking about Abraham Lincoln, nobody would discount what I do or don't know because I wasn't alive when Lincoln was alive. I ended up doing a lot of research and having a lot of conversations and personal memories and, moments in time where I personally witnessed history aren't playing into, my ability to tell the story. And Bill Bartholomew is a prime example of that because I had the pleasure of interviewing him for our PBS documentary, A Braves New World, that we did with Milwaukee Public Television. And he was very nice. He was very gracious. And first and foremost, like Lou Perini, he was a businessman. And even though he grew up on the north side of Chicago, he looked at the Braves as a financial investment. And as much as I believe in his heart, he wanted to keep the Braves in Milwaukee. At that point, he realized the Braves were damaged. They had an image problem, as far as, the city loved them, but there was a lot of infighting between the organization and the county board of supervisors at the time. And the city, had switched mayors at this point and was definitely moving away for being, very progressive. And they, also the financial limitations that Milwaukee presented with the onset of television, which in the 60s was exploding. Milwaukee was very limited. And Bill Bartholomew, saw all of this, realized the apathetic, fan base, and, decided that he wasn't going to, the Braves were not going to be a wise investment if they stayed in Milwaukee. So then he started shopping the franchise. And this is after, the Braves even had a stock sale similar to what the Green Bay Packers did or have done throughout history. And the Packers have always had resounding results. But, when the Braves did it in Milwaukee, hardly anybody bought stock. So that fundraising attempt to kind of create some equity in the franchise, really proved how apathetic the fan base was. And that's when Bill Bartholomew started looking elsewhere.
Why Atlanta?
Well, first and foremost, television. Because in the 60s, television was exploding. This is when, the NFL and then obviously the AFL, were exploding. Television was becoming a very financially gratifying medium, especially for sports. And Milwaukee, where Milwaukee is located, it's boxed in because to the south you have Chicago. To the west at that point you had, Minnesota. And to the east you had Lake Michigan. And there isn't much to the north. So Milwaukee's television market was very small with very little growth potential. And Atlanta, like I mentioned earlier, lured the Braves to their city with the same business model Milwaukee did. They built a stadium, that was ready to move in. And then they started courting baseball teams. And the Furman Bisher, who was a Atlanta Journal-Constitution sports writer, wrote a great book outlining, a blow-by-blow of how Atlanta lured the Braves from Milwaukee. And it almost plays out identical to what Milwaukee did to get the Braves out of Boston. And as far as television goes, Atlanta offered the Braves a television market, everything south of the Mason-Dixon line and, east of the Mississippi. So, you have, all of those southeastern states, Florida, Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, Tennessee, southern part of, Virginia, the Carolinas, it was enormous. And Atlanta also had a lot of corporate sponsors that, Milwaukee still had Miller, but Atlanta offered up Coca-Cola and Kodak and dozens of other really big franchises, because at the time Atlanta was, the unofficial capital of the South and was a booming city. So they were very hungry for baseball, and they essentially extended an offer, the Bartholomew and his group could not refuse, because from a business standpoint, it was the smart thing to do. And, you take away passion and loyalty and tradition, and if you just look at the numbers on a spreadsheet comparing the two, it's a slam dunk. There is no question from a financial standpoint why the Braves moved to Atlanta. Personally, it's sad because I would have loved to have grown up, with the tradition of the Milwaukee Braves, but, with ignorance being bliss, I grew up a Milwaukee Brewers fan, and I'm happy because they've created some really fun traditions and fun memories along the way. But, Bartholomew and his group, once they checked the math, there was no stopping their move. And Major League Baseball knew it as soon as the offer was extended, and there was no stopping the Braves moving. It was, a manifest destiny, if you will, where baseball was going to move into the South. The Braves happened to be the team to do it first.
And October 64 is when he announced that they were moving to Atlanta. It seems like he also, though, was trying to do that somewhat quickly, because apparently Kansas City was also in the mix to go to Atlanta too, right?
Yeah.
The A's, of course.
Yeah. Charles Finley was, shopping his athletics franchise around, and ultimately he took him to Oakland, but, and he had already moved him from Philadelphia. He was definitely an opportunist. And, so there was, this urban arms race, happening, and, Atlanta was the crown jewel at the time. And, much like Milwaukee with the St. Louis Browns, who eventually became the Baltimore Orioles, the A's were also being courted, which, kind of forced Bartholomew's hand, and he, moved the team, announced the move. And then, the city of Milwaukee fought back, and it got caught up in the courts, which created the lame duck season of 1965, where, the move was kind of stuck in the courts, but it's really hard to keep a franchise from moving, if a franchise wants to move, and that's ultimately what happened.
Well, maybe this is a good way to sort of, as a denouement here, let's talk about 65, because while a lame duck season, and it seemed to me that the first part of that season, the fans voiced their displeasure by attending games in the low thousands per game.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened, ironically, during the middle of the season? They got hot, didn't they? The team. Yeah,
they got hot, but they got hot, and they were in the pennant race for a while, but like I mentioned, the well was really poisoned. And, my friends who, were teenagers during those years, remember that season and mentioned how it was really surreal. Because even if you went to County Stadium and here you are watching the hot hometown team, there was somewhat of a disconnect because you knew they were moving and you knew it was inevitable. And even though you held out hope that the courts might reverse it, then you had a team stuck in a city that didn't want to be there and an ownership group that, didn't want to be there. And that's why, they, I think, were just north of 500,000 fans, like 555,000 fans over the course of the season. And, from all accounts, it was a very surreal season because here you had this team that was in the pennant race until the end, but, nobody cared. And, the manager, Bobby Bragan, was not a popular manager as far as, he was definitely branded a company man and kind of an extended mouthpiece of Bartholomew and his group at the time. So, the local press didn't warm up to him. And yeah, it was at that point, it was such a toxic environment that, it was a sad lame duck season.
Yeah, it's interesting. Very interesting. But it also seems, though, to me that the snit that the team and I guess before 65 was declared basically as a must-play season in lame duck fashion. It seemed that Major League Baseball did, and I don't know when, this is a good question, maybe you don't know the answer to this, did sort of take notice and along the way figure out that they had to come back to Milwaukee at some point, and ultimately the Brewers in 70 filled that gap.
Yeah, one of the positives that came out of the Braves moving is Bud Selig, who, his story has been well documented, as he rose from a car salesman to commissioner of baseball. He created a corporation to essentially keep the Braves in Milwaukee. He tried to stir up local ownership to buy the team from Bartholomew, but Bartholomew had no interest in selling because, the big fat carrot dangling in Atlanta gave Bartholomew no incentive to sell the team in Milwaukee because there was so much potential in Atlanta. But the lemonade that came out of the lemons is that Bud Selig got involved in baseball, and that's where he started, shaking hands and meeting the power players in baseball. And after the Braves moved, he helped organize the Chicago White Sox came up to County Stadium, before the Brewers arrived in 70 for some exhibition games, for some regular season games over the course of some of those seasons in the late 60s. And then ultimately Bud Selig was the spearhead of the ownership group that purchased the Seattle Pilots, essentially during spring training of 1970. And that's, another, fun irony is that, the Milwaukee Brewers, literally overnight went from being the Seattle Pilots to the Milwaukee Brewers. And, the people who, were stitching uniforms were pulling off, the letters Pilots off the jerseys and stitching in Brewers and pulling off the S's off their hats and stitching M's and, and literally overnight Milwaukee got a baseball team again in spring training of 1970. But, a lot of that was because Bud Selig was so passionate about having baseball in Milwaukee, he went out and did something about it.
That's a story that I want to go on another episode, whether that's Jim Bouton, if he is still able and willing to recount that story, or perhaps, some other folks in and around the sort of 1 year of the Seattle Pilots is obviously a fascinating story in its own right. Okay, so let's give a shout out, Bill, to the book and the two movies that you've done. You want to maybe just explain to the audience the names of them and perhaps where they can be found and or the context for them.
Yeah, the book is The Milwaukee Braves, Heroes and Heartbreak, which is published by the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. It's still available in bookstores in southeastern Wisconsin, and if not, it's still in print. So it's, you can get it on Amazon or, going to the Wisconsin Historical Society Press website, which is wisconsinhistory.org. And then when I did that, it led me down the rabbit hole, so to speak, to do a documentary in cooperation with the Wisconsin Historical Society Press and Milwaukee Public Television and PBS called A Braves New World. And that's also available through the Wisconsin Historical Society and probably easily found on their website, A Braves New World. And that is the documentary where we really follow the financial breadcrumbs of the Braves move from Boston to Milwaukee and then from Milwaukee to Atlanta, and how the Braves spurned this urban arms race that ultimately resulted in communities competing against one another for major league sports clubs and justified baseball's manifest destiny west, where, like I mentioned earlier, Dallas got a team, Kansas City got a team, Minneapolis got a team. The Dodgers and the Giants moving from New York to the West Coast is a direct result of Lou Perini's success in Milwaukee, because even Walter O'Malley quoted that as his argument for why the Dodgers deserve better in Brooklyn. And if they can't get a better stadium and more parking in Brooklyn, he's going to Los Angeles, because that's where baseball is headed. And he wanted to be the first one there. And so that documentary was a lot of fun. I got to, interview, Del Crandall, Felix Mantilla, and then also, some of the people behind the scenes, like Bill Bartholomew, and then, some really decorated Braves historians like Bob Beege. And that's, that was a lot of fun, because writing a book is a very solitary experience. You're sitting there, hunkered over stats and newspaper articles and pulling quotes out of books and interviews, transcripts. And it's fun because you're almost like Indiana Jones, but with, baseball history. But doing the documentary where, you get we went down to Atlanta to interview some of the major players, and, we, went to Chicago to interview Bartholomew, and, we were in Milwaukee, and we got to, visit some archives, of old Milwaukee Braves memorabilia and history. It's like, that was fun, because that's one of those, bucket list life memory moments where you're like, I'm holding, a 1957, World Series ring, or, I'm holding Eddie Matthews jersey, or, here's a stock certificate from when Bartholomew's group tried to rally financial support. And, you're actually witnessing history, and that was a lot of fun. And, along the way, we did a special for Fox Sports Wisconsin called Milwaukee Braves: The Golden Legacy, which was a celebration, the 50th anniversary celebration of the 1957 World Series championship team, which was held by the Milwaukee Braves Historical Association. And I don't know if that DVD is still in print, but I believe there's still copies floating around. But yeah, that was called Milwaukee Braves: The Golden Legacy, and that was, kind of commemorating the 1957 World Series team. So those are the three projects that I did that were, directly associated with the Braves. And along the way, I've written a few books on the Green Bay Packers, including Green Bay Packers, Trials, Triumphs, and Traditions, which celebrates, especially the financial impact of the team through the years and how they are a financial anomaly. And then the last book I wrote that has ties to Wisconsin is called Some Like It Cold, Surfing the Malibu of the Midwest. And that's about two brothers in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, which is about 30 miles north of Milwaukee, who had a dream of surfing the world. This is during the days of Frankie and Annette and Beach Blanket Bingo and the Beach Boys and Gidget. And they had dreams of surfing the world, but growing up in Sheboygan, they couldn't afford it. But they were so passionate about surfing, they brought the surfing world to Sheboygan, and now Sheboygan is one of the most cherished international surfing destinations, and on a lot of professional surfers and, even casual surfers' bucket lists of places to surf. So
I have been to Sheboygan. I live in northern Illinois. It lives about 30 miles north of Chicago, and I've been to Sheboygan. I didn't even know that. That's amazing. Yep.
They for 25 years they hosted the Dairyland Surf Classic, and which was the largest freshwater surfing contest in the world. And it's a lot of people call Sheboygan the Malibu of the Midwest. Yeah, it's a fascinating story, and that's one of those, kind of like the Braves, where I grew up hearing stories about these guys that surf Lake Michigan, and then, my curiosity finally bit me, and I called them up and said, "Are you guys for real?" And they said, "Yep," and we started talking, and then it turned out to be a very fun book.
Yeah, so you West Coast surf snobs, you can't get a good bratwurst in Malibu, that's for sure. The real Malibu. Anything else you want to plug, including your day job and what you do for a living and all that fun stuff? How can people get in touch with you?
Probably the best way people can get in touch with me is, I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Povletich. You type in Povletich into a Google search, odds are I'm going to be the guy that pops up, just because, there's only a handful of us on the planet. And doing these Packers and Braves and surfing projects, they were passion projects. It's one of those where, you have your day job that feeds your pocketbook, and then you have these passion projects that feed your soul. And so to have the opportunity to do them, I've been very blessed and very fortunate because, I've had a lot of bucket list moments through the years doing these, and, and who doesn't love to talk about the Milwaukee Braves, right?
Well, and there you go. And so I'm sure another element for your bucket list concluded today with this conversation on this little podcast we call Good Seats of the Vote. So, Bill, thank you. This has been awesome. I especially think it's especially interesting that we've delved in a lot of teams and leagues and all those kinds of things, and clearly a lot of them, not all, but a lot of these stories emanate from some personal relationship or memories, maybe from childhood or whatever. But this is interesting. I mean, you've delved into a story that you had, if you will, no personal interest in, no dog in the hunt, if you will. And I think it's a testament to how you went about the process, even though you had no personal relationship with the team, having actually been born after the team was there. So very interesting.
Yeah, I still love the Milwaukee Braves, and I'm fortunate I got to experience them through these projects because, their 13 years in Milwaukee were special. They never had a losing season, but more importantly, they ignited a community and they galvanized the community for a while. And, the likes of which have not been experienced since, with all these other franchises, Nowadays, franchises seem to be moving around almost as much as some of the players in free agency, so to experience that and, have some historical perspective, it was special.
All right, there's our chat with Bill Povletich, a very interesting one about the Milwaukee Braves of the National League in baseball. 1953 to 1965, short-lived, but a passionate love affair, very much so, at least in the early days in Milwaukee, and a part of Braves history that seems to be overlooked, and that's why we kind of delve into these conversations. And, look, some great stars, some all-stars like Warren Spahn and Hank Aaron, of course. This is amazing just memories of a team that, won the world championship in 1957. It was very competitive, was, gangbusters at the gate. And look, the legacy of the team in what it meant for a growing nation, a prosperous one, and a rethink of how professional sports and their franchises were spread across that country, or potentially so, as populations expanded south and west and beyond the East Coast bastions and Midwest bastions of where baseball and pro sports had been. So a lot of not so obvious things that the Milwaukee version of the Braves led to, not only in Major League Baseball, but professional sports generally. And we thank Bill for his writings and his film and his conversation with us. So promotionally, make sure that you find that book that Bill wrote. It's called Milwaukee Braves, Heroes and Heartbreak. It is published by Wisconsin Historical Society Press. It is available wherever good books are found. You'll find a link to it on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just look for the episode with Bill and the Milwaukee Braves, and you will find a link to it. You will also find there a link to one of the two documentary films that we discussed. That's his 2009 work called A Braves New World. Don't forget the plural there, A Braves New World. That was produced in conjunction with and for Milwaukee Public Television. That is also available in DVD form. And again, you can find a link to that on our website for under our episode. I'm sure you can find it wherever good books and film are found, including Amazon and Barnes & Noble and all those kinds of great places. For us, we want to make sure that you remember that goodseatsstillavailable.com, as we said, is the place to always go to find out what's going on with our show. We've got so many more things lined up, not only including just great guests, but some other fun stuff, hopefully a Patreon page where you can kind of help support the show and get some goodies and some shout outs and all that kind of stuff. We got a newsletter in the pipeline and just some amazing, hopefully on-site interviews and all kinds of other good stuff. So keep tuned. If there's a topic or a sport or a team or whatever that you haven't heard that you're interested in, not only let us know, but keep listening, because you never know when we finally will get to your topic and your subject matter. So thank you for listening and staying with us. Twitter, at Good Seats Still. Please visit us there. Facebook, there's a page devoted to us, Good Seats Still Available. Instagram, a daily fun little image of historical note can be found at Good Seats Still Available on Instagram. So thanks for all that. And again, of course, our continued thanks to our friends at Podfly Productions. That's podfly.net if you need podcast production help and support. You can't find better people than Eric Begay, Jerry Payne, Corey Coates, David Gregerson, the entire team at Podfly Productions, podfly.net. Tell them that Tim Hanlon and or the Good Seats Still Available podcast sent you. Okay, I'm done. Thanks so much for listening. We'll take care. I hope you all take care of yourself, and we'll talk to you hopefully next week with another great episode. Take care. Bye-bye.